In this viral video of the Kenyan professor PLO Lumumba answers the questions surrounding the Israeli-Palestine war that is still going on.
The question of the war in Gaza is one that is alive and well. It continues to generate reactions and questions, and in reaction to my sentiment, there are hundreds of questions that have come about, raising pertinent issues. Is two-state solution the solution? How do we deal with non-state actors? What is the nature of the state of Israel? What is the nature of Palestine? What is the role of the international community? What should the International Court of Justice do in the face of the representation by South Africa?
This interview was conducted live, and viewers asked questions concerning the war that is ongoing and the possibility of ending this war. This war has become a global concern, where we've seen many countries, many nations coming out to condemn the acts of Israel attacking Gaza and its citizens. Now, Lumumba exposed the possibility of ending this war and conflicts. He also delves into Israel's acknowledgement of its nuclear capability, sparking inquiries into other nations' potential for initiating nuclear warfare, despite the widespread threat posed by nuclear weapons. Certain countries persist in endorsing their use. Sit, relax, and watch the episode.
The conflict in Gaza is a conflict that has generated different reactions, and this is to be understood. We saw this in the early years of the Nakba in 1948. We saw this in 1967 in Yom Kippur. We saw this in 1973. We saw these kinds of reactions in the Intifada. And I note that there have been quite a number of reactions since I made my position known on the ongoing conflict in Gaza. First of all, it's always good to preface a response to reactions with the caveat that nobody has a monopoly of knowledge, nobody has a monopoly of wisdom, that what one does is to share one's perspective with the others in the hope that that enriches the debate. I see a number of comments here about the Balfour Declaration. And it must be remembered that the Balfour Declarations was a series of events beginning as it were in 1917, and there were also similar declarations in 1948 that were an offshoot of that declaration. And I can't agree more with those who say that because of the decision at that time, in 1917 initially and 1948 culminating in the creation of what was fundamentally a Jewish state, and the failure of the world at that time to create a Palestinian state, that in many ways has been the genesis of the conflict. So that the Israelis have always been seen by the Palestinians and the Arab neighbors as an occupying force. And many of the wars that have been fought have been on the basis that we are dealing with Israel, which is a Zionist regime, which is an occupying force. And it is in that context that all these attempts that have been made through successive administrations, whether it's Yitzhak Rabin, whether it's Menahem Begin, and a little earlier, even during the reign of the administration of Golda Meir, and of course during the Netanyahu periods, and we saw that all these particular problems have gained the attention of the world, culminating much more prominently in the Oslo Accords. And the Oslo Accords were designed to resolve the problem for all times by creating two states. But that was never to be. We ended up with a Palestinian Authority, and that Palestinian Authority also had its own problems, leading in the bitter fight between the Hamas and Fatah, and with Hamas occupying Gaza. So when we say that the conflict has brought about many non-state actors such as Hamas, Hezbollah, and all these others, we are actually admitting that this is the time that the world should come and say with no equivocation that if we are to resolve the problem in the Middle East, we must have a two-state solution. A two-state solution whose fundamental anchor is that Israel exists and is recognized as such, that Palestine is recognized as such, and they exist side by side, subject to international law. As to whether that will immunize the region from the conflicts that we continue to see, and including the Gaza war, is one that is out for debate. But what has happened and continues to happen in Gaza is creating enmity, which will be difficult to eliminate for generations to come. The other concern that I've seen or response is the question of what has been described as white supremacy. You know, there are those who argue that those who occupy and control Israel are not Jews in the strict sense, that these are white supremacists who are hiding behind the cloak of Jewishness in order to visit pain upon the Palestinians. In fact, I've heard even in the continent of Africa, some arguing that the Israelis who are of Caucasian origin are racists, and they have given the example of how they treat the Ethiopian Jews who are brought to Israel under the Operation Moses. There is merit in that, but I think that the question that we ought to preoccupy ourselves with at this time is how to eliminate conflict in the long run. And the way to eliminate conflict, as we have said times without number, is to find a lasting solution. The danger is that we now see a world that is divided, particularly at the political level. In the Western world, everybody, almost to a man, that is to mean politicians, is reluctant to condemn the Israeli response to the activities on the 7th day of October, the year 2023. And those who argue, therefore, because of the European support, the Israelis are thus encouraged. And there are those who, on the other side, are saying that it is important that the organizations such as Hamas, Hezbollah, and we have now seen the Houthis ought to be reined in as a condition precedent to any lasting peace. It is an egg and chicken kind of situation. What do you deal with? The international community through the UN have now said that there is need for a pause or a ceasefire, which will enable the world to look at these issues squarely in the face and find a long-term solution. Whether that is going to happen is another debate. We now see within Israel herself that there are centrifugal forces which say that Prime Minister Netanyahu must find a different approach to the war in Gaza, because the Israeli military thought that it would be a quick fix, but is now appearing that it is for the long haul. So my own view is the sooner Europe and America encourage the Israelis to cease fire with a reciprocal understanding that Hamas and other non-state actors such as Hezbollah and the Houthis will also cease fire so that the world can engage in a constructive way, the safer it is, because the whole world is affected by this war. I see here, for example, I have a comment from my friend Douglas Mochama. And Douglas says, unfortunately, the Hamas has used all its time and energy to radicalize all Gazans to hate their longtime neighbors, Israel. Completely true. In fact, it is now argued that every other person in Gaza is being told you have a permanent enemy in Israel. And this is bound to happen. When somebody loses their family in a bombardment, then the only reason why they continue to live is for revenge. And this is one of the reasons why the sooner this war is brought to a halt, the safer everybody is. And I can't agree more with the Douglas Mochama, who takes this view that there is radicalization. And it's not only within Gaza. You can see it even in Lebanon by Hezbollah. You can see it even from the rhetoric that one sees coming out of Yemen through the Houthis. So we are living in quite difficult times, particularly as regards this war. And one must comment that it's a war that affects all of us, because when you interfere with shipping in the Gulf of Aden and in the Red Sea, then everybody suffers. Joseph Hudo, have you asked why Israel has blocked two-state solution? If stateless Palestine can hatch October 7th, then what could happen with the state? Security is Israel's prime fear. They are an existential threat. Secondly, how do you expect Israel to defend itself against rockets launched from hostels, UN facilities, residential homes? Please give an example of how to make the war proportionate. A very, very valid question from Joseph there, because it is very easy to say that this war is not proportionate, the response is not proportionate. And we have had, I'm answering this question by Joseph at a time when the ICJ has pronounced itself on the representation made by the South Africans asking Israel to ensure that genocidal acts are not carried out, effectively just stopping short of saying we need a ceasefire. But I hold the view, which view is capable of being interrogated, that you are safer dealing with a state which is recognized under international law, which is obligated to act in a responsible manner. If you don't have a state, and Palestine is not a state within the understanding of, or within the meaning of international law, then it allows organizations such as Hamas to exist. It allows organizations such as Al-Qassam Brigade. It allows organizations such as Hezbollah. It allows other organizations to operate outside of international law. And when they operate outside of international law, in my view, they are a greater threat to Israel, because the weapons that they acquire are acquired in an irregular manner and you do not know. But if it was a Palestinian state, which is recognized as such, which acquires arms in a regular way, then they would be under obligation to behave properly. Then they would not use human beings as shields. They would not use civilian facilities for purposes of military action. So to that extent, you are safer with a state which is recognized as such, which exists and which is obligated to respect international law. That is not to say that a state within the meaning of international law does not threaten Israel, but then it is easier to deal with it because you and me know that states are involved in conflict, notwithstanding that they are obligated to act otherwise internationally. Once again, we are not engaged or involved in any mathematics so as to know that this is proportionate and this is not proportionate. But if you look at the rhetoric of the military officers in Israel or the politicians in Israel, they have said, we are going to fight a war like no other war so that Hamas will never operate. We are going to ensure that Gaza is not habitable. And that is not proportionality. Not easy to argue in favor of, and it is easy from the comfort of our armchairs to argue the way we are arguing, but it's not easy for those who are actually in the theater and the arena of war. You and me can afford the luxury of intellectual and cool analysis, but yet the realities on the ground do not lend themselves to the kind of cool analysis in which we are engaged. A man who calls himself Curious George, and let me speak to your curiosity, super curious George. Most of these mistakes make sense, but the point about non-state actors going after civilian target is scary. Make me question the logic. Why can a state actor deem a target necessary for its own political gain, but a non-state actor, which in some of these places are acting on behalf of their people, cannot go after targets it deems threat? Either countries abide by international law or they don't. You know, the world has known pain. And let us understand, after 1945 war, the so-called World War II, the very reason why the genocide became the focus of international community, and we had a treaty on genocide in 1948 with Israel being the first signatory, was out of what was visited upon the Israelis by the German administration. And it's now accepted that nearly 6 billion Jews were targeted because of their race, they were targeted because of their religion. And then the world said, we must never allow this to happen again. No more genocide. And we even said in Geneva in 1949, we even said, even when we conduct war, because human beings somehow accept that war will always exist, we then obligated combatants that even in circumstances when wars are being prosecuted, there are certain things that must not be done. This is the basis of the 4 Geneva Conventions of 1949. But even after that, we have seen genocide or genocidal activities. We've seen that in Serbia. We have seen that in places like Rwanda, which tells you that both state and non-state actors tend to conduct themselves in a manner that is inimical to the prescriptions and the injunctions that are placed upon them by law. And this in itself is a sad thing. And that is why we have international institutions which punish such individuals. We saw that with Slobodan Milosevic after the Bosnia War, and we have seen that the very reason why you created the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court is to ensure that those who do not conduct themselves in a manner that is in keeping with the law will be punished in accordance with the law. And we have these permanent institutions because prior to that, you had ad hoc trials, such as the Nuremberg trials, such as the Tokyo tribunals, such as Sierra Leone, such as Rwanda. But we now know better that these institutions, to the extent that is humanly possible, are going to do that. Once again, always easy to argue in the manner that we do, but yet the reality is that it is not easy.
Let me take you back to how this conflict between Palestine and Israel came into existence. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is an ongoing military and political conflict in the Levant, beginning in the mid-20th century. It is one of the longest continuing conflict. Key areas of the conflict include Israel occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, the status of the Jerusalem, Israel settlement, borders, security and water rights, as well as Palestinian freedom of movement and the Palestinian right of return. The conflict has its origin in the arrival of Jewish immigrants and settlers to Palestine in the late 19th and 20th centuries and the advent of the Zionist movement. The local Arab population opposed Zionism primarily out of fear of territorial displacement and dispossessions. The Zionist movement garnered the support of an imperial power in the 1917 Balfour Declaration issued by Britain, which promised to support the creation of Jewish homeland in Palestine. Following the World War I, mandatory Palestine was established and tensions grew into open sectarian conflict between Jews and Arabs. In 1936, an Arab revolt erupted demanding an independence, which the British suppressed. In 1947, United Nations partition plan for Palestine triggered the 1948 Palestine War, which saw expulsion and flight of most Palestinian Arabs and establishment of Israel, most of the Mandate territory, and the control of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank by Egypt and Jordan, respectively. In 1967, Six-Day War, Israel occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which became known as the Palestinian territories, which is now considered to be the longest military occupation in modern history, and has drawn international condemnation for violating the human rights of the Palestinians. The conflict has claimed many civilian casualties, mostly Palestinians. Since its inception, various attempts have been made to resolve the conflict as part of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, alongside efforts to resolve the broader Arab-Israel conflict. Progress towards a negotiated solution between the Israeli government and the Palestinian Liberation Organization was made with the Oslo Accord of the 1993 to 1995. The majority of recent peace efforts have been centered around two-state solution, which involves the establishment of an independent Palestinian state alongside Israel. Public support for two-state solution, which formerly enjoyed support from both Israeli Jews and Palestinians, has dwindled in recent years. Official negotiations are mediated by the Quartet of the Middle East, which consists of United Nations, the United States, Russia, and European Union, the Arab League, which has proposed the Arab Peace Initiative, in another important actor, along with Egypt, Jordan. Since 2006, the Palestinian side has been split between Fatah, dominating the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, and Hamas, that gained control of Gaza Strip. Attempts to remedy this have been repeated and continuing since 2019. The Israel side has also been experiencing political crisis. Now the latest round of peace negotiation began in July 2013, but were suspended in 2014. Since 2006, Hamas and Israel have fought 5 wars, the most recent of which began in 2023 and is ongoing as of February 2024. So you see the history of this conflict that started way back in 1940s. Thank you for watching and subscribing. Kindly share your thoughts and how you think this conflict can be solved and the war come to an end.